yes, passing fads. Things that were briefly popular, sometimes extremely popular, but then over time they became quite the opposite. This week's top 5, we're going to look at the top 5 passing fads of the 1970s. Back in episode 35, I did 80s passing fads. And then in episode 72, I did 90s passing fads. So here we are at the 70s. This is going to be a mix of things that you probably have heard of and some that you may not remember, especially if you weren't alive back then, but I mean in general. And I'll say it again, passing fad is something that was briefly popular, and the term brief, I don't know how long that is, few months, a year or two, but all of these are really products of the decade they're from. As with most of these top 5s, there are some honorable mentions, and the top 5 itself is in no particular order. So enough of the setup. Let's kick this off with the honorable mentions. Honorable mentions for passing fads of the 1970s include avocado colors in houses. This could be paint on the walls, colors of furniture, but it's that muted kind of dark green of an avocado that was hugely popular. I can picture it in my head. There was also Billy beer, which was a beer made by President Jimmy Carter's brother, Billy. If you have unopened cans of that, they're collector's items now, but they were briefly in style. There were puka shell necklaces, a style of the Southern California, Hawaiian surf scene, but then could be worn by anyone, anywhere, because it definitely fits in the middle of Nebraska, puka shell necklaces. There was water beds, which was a rubber bladder filled with water that you would sleep on. My friend Matt, he had a water bed, so in the mid-'80s, sleeping over his house, it was fun sleeping on a water bed. And the final honorable mention was fondue parties. You'd have a fondue set of pots, cooking equipment. It would have chocolate melted or cheese melted, and you would have various types of food, whether it was meat or cheese or fruit or whatever you wanted. And people would come over and hang out, and that would be it. Your meal was dipping some kind of food on a toothpick in melted cheese or melted chocolate. So those are the honorable mentions. Did any of you have any of those? Did you go to fondue parties and sleep on a waterbed? Well, let's kick off the actual top 5 with number 1, shag carpeting. A lot of you that are younger or, even into your 30s, you might know shag carpeting as the thing that you need to rip out of houses that you buy where the carpeting was put in the 70s. I've actually heard that a few times. People buying a house and they go in, well, we got to rip out the shag carpeting. The gist of shag carpeting was that it was a much thicker carpet, typically a couple of inches tall. It would feel good walking through it, running your toes through the shag. It was in style back in the 70s. You might see it in one of those sunken living rooms. You walk in and it steps down and there's this little pit in the middle. The major problem with shag carpeting was when it came to cleaning it. If any of the pieces of the carpet were loose and you'd get the longer shag stuck in the vacuum, or you'd never be able to get everything out from in the deep crevices of this shag. It got to be such an issue that a company actually made something called a shag rake. You could buy a rake to clean your carpet instead of vacuuming because the shag was so deep. Rake it like it's a sand trap on the golf course. Look it up. The company I found is called Cedar. There's pictures of advertisements of this woman raking her carpet. Number 2 is CB radios. Now, obviously, truckers, they've had CB radios, still have CB radios. It's essential for their jobs. I'm talking about CB radios for just the average everyday driver, like in their car. Movies like Convoy and Smokey and the Bandit really popularized CB radios outside of a typical trucker situation, where if you wanted to be cool like Burt Reynolds, you get a CB radio in your Datsun or Plymouth or Renault, or even in your Ford Pinto. The rise in the popularity of the CB radio came with how it became more affordable in the early 70s. Plus the gas shortage, it allowed truckers and others to communicate with each other and let people know which gas stations were out of gas or which ones had cheaper prices. So it was definitely useful, but way more out of place in a sedan instead of an 18-wheeler. Number 3 is Earth shoes. These were released in 1970, only a few weeks before the first Earth Day. They were invented by a Danish yoga instructor and shoe designer, and it was known for its negative heel technology, where the sole of the shoe was thinner at the heel, causing you to walk with a heel-first landing, which was supposedly gave you health benefits. They had shoes, boots, sandals, all with the negative heel technology. By 1976, Earth shoes had sales of $14 million. The reason this became a passing fad was not because they lost popularity, but because the company that was making them, they had to go out of business in 1977 because they couldn't keep up with demand. They basically became a victim of their own success, which is wild. Number 4 is mood rings. I remember still being able to get these at the corner store in the 1980s. A ring that would change color, supposedly to show what your mood was to others. It was a process known as thermochromism, where body heat would change the colors, so it really didn't change with your mood. And the rings themselves, they didn't have these nice gems on them. They were plastic and cheap. That didn't stop the creators from selling these rings for up to $45 in the 70s. Think about that. Would you buy a mood ring now in 2024 for $45? These only lasted a few years in popularity. They were still around, but once people realized that sweating from excitement or sticking your hand in hot water would elicit the same color on the ring, it kind of lost the novelty. And finally, number 5 on the top 5 passing fads of the 1970s is one that I had to include, and I saved it for last, and that is pet rocks. These are infamous signs from the 70s. A box that looked like what you'd get a Happy Meal in from McDonald's, but inside was a rock with straw. There were holes poked in the box so your rock could breathe. Advertising executive Gary Dahl came up with the pet rock in 1975. The craze lasted less than 1 year, but Gary Dahl sold more than 1 million pet rocks at $4 each. It's pretty simple math. He made about $4 million in less than a year selling rocks to people. That would translate to just over $22 million in 2024. And this is where crackpot ideas come from. The success of the pet rock leads to people thinking of the stupidest thing to possibly have people buy and then making it, because you never know. You use the pet rock as inspiration. But there you have it. Top 5 passing fads of the 1970s. Were you familiar with all of these? Did you have any of these? I would think you'd be most familiar with shag carpeting or pet rocks. And the shag carpet rake, I'm still laughing about that.